absolutely delighted to be joined this afternoon by Dr. David Robinson of the University of Central Lancashire. And we today are going to be talking about a really interesting, fascinating paper that's just been released that Dave was the lead author on. It's been released at the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and it's the title says it all, really, how important this is. And it's Datura quids at Pinwheel Cave, California, provide unambiguous confirmation of the ingestion of hallucinogenics at rock art sites. And I got my tongue around that. I'm sure you've said it many a time.
So easy for you to say, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. I know. So that is, it really is a fascinating paper. I've read it, and I have had the benefit as a UCLan student, privilege really to go out to California with you, as is a thing that's offered to a lot of the students. So I know where this place is, and it is absolutely stunning. So maybe if you would just start just by setting the context of where this place is, where Pinwheel Cave is.
Yeah, so it's located on a place called the Windwills Preserve, and this is about 100,000 acres of contiguous landscape right in the heart of South Central California. So if you can imagine California, Los Angeles, down there in Southern California, if you were to drive straight north from Los Angeles, about 100 miles or so, you'll end up in that landscape. So it's not on the coast; it's inland, and it's a pretty hilly area. It's part of a series of mountain ranges that are being pushed up out of the floor of California by the San Andreas Fault. Yeah. So it's highly tectonically active, and so it's this gorgeous landscape that's being preserved by the Wildlands Conservancy and the Windwills Preserve for the threatened and endangered species that live in those landscapes. But also the archaeology, as you know, is phenomenal out there. So Pinwheel Cave itself is a bit unique because most of the rock art sites out there are on this really gorgeous sort of sinuous sandstone, and the paintings are put on that kind of rock usually. But this site, which you can see behind you in your background setting, is the rock itself is this bouldery conglomerate mudflow breccia. So it's got a really distinctive different shape to it and color to it and consistency to it. As you can see, there's all kinds of little pockets in there that were formed when the rock itself was formed, and the site itself is these large boulders that are sort of all stacked together on this gentle slope in this open oak woodland. And it's right next to a series of springs where there's lots of water. And then it has these fantastic views from a nearby bedrock mortar complex. And that's where a lot of food was being processed, is at the bedrock mortar complex, out over the southern San Joaquin Valley, which stretches on for hundreds of miles. So it's a gorgeous setting, and but it's out in this place called the Windwills Preserve, which is this sort of semi-arid classic California landscape. Yeah. If you ever seen the movie Sideways, it looks a lot like the landscapes you see in Sideways.
Yeah, well, I was actually quite privileged because I went with you in the springtime and it was green, lush green actually, which is probably unusual. But yeah. I'll probably try to put some of the pictures up during this talk so people can vision it. But it's it was an amazing place. And this paper, obviously you discussed it when we were at the site, but this paper has got a lot of interest. I think the last time I looked, there was 87 or so news media outlets throughout the whole world who were interested in this, and I've put the paper up in perhaps the top 5 of interest at the moment in within academia. That's some going. So
people like hallucinogens.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's been, a lot of people have discussed it for many years, and now you've got the evidence. So what did you find out?
Well, what we found out is that the native Californians were processing and consuming a plant called Datura. And Datura is a member of the nightshade family. It's called gypsy weed out there. And it's highly toxic, but those toxins also are hallucinogens. And if you don't take too much, If you take too much, it can kill you. But if you take the right amount and it's prepared in a proper way by people who know what they're doing, such as the native Californians figured out how to do, then you can have what we would call hallucinogenic experiences. They would class it as encountering, the spirit dimension, or just seeing the world with new eyes. But so we discovered this stuff that was right next to the painting of the pinwheel, which you can see behind you. So that painting has these 5 sort of S-shaped arms radiating out from a central spoke. And the flower itself, the Datura flower, which is right behind me, you can see it has that same sort of form. It has these 5 pinwheeling arms coming out of the central bud. So it's the Datura flower as it opens, it pinwheels open, and then it releases its scent, and then that attracts pollinators. And the plant itself contains copious amounts of various psychotropic compounds, including scopolamine and atropine. And those are the amongst others, other compounds too. But those are the main compounds that actually instigate the what we call hallucinogenic experience. So we found those plants in stuffed up into the crevices. Yeah. But we didn't really know. I mean, we didn't know that at the time. So when we first saw the cave, when we first went to the cave, actually some people working on the preserve were the ones who discovered it. And so they contacted some people to come and record the rock art site, the rock art documentation group, and a guy named Jack Sprague also recorded the site. And they took me there, and they pointed out these fibrous materials shoved up in the crevices.
I remember seeing them.
And so they pointed out that this pinwheel looked like Datura, like the opening of the plant Datura. So we all just thought, well, could these plant products actually be Datura? But it would be really it was a wild speculation to suggest that. And the reason for that is that this material, they're called quids, and they're found all over the American West in dry cave deposits, and they're routinely analyzed by archaeologists. And invariably, they're usually some sort of nutritional food, yucca, agave, things like that. They're tough, fibrous parts of plants that you can't swallow because they're too tough, but you can chew on them, and then you masticate them, and that extracts the nutrients. Yeah. And then when you're done, you just chuck them. So they're found in cave deposits all over the American West, and it's not unusual to find those. But I never heard of any stuck up in crevices like chewing gum on the back of your headboard. At the same time, chewing was not the normal way that the ethnographic accounts say that Datura was consumed by native groups such as the Chumash. Native groups usually drank it in a tea or brew called toloache. And what they would do is they would go out and they would go to the plant, and they would talk to it, ask for its permission, sing to it sometimes, harvest part of it like the root, or sometimes take the entire plant, and then they would pound that plant up in a mortar and pestle, and they would add water in, and they'd steep it for a while, and then they would drink that water in a prescribed amount. If you drink too much, you could die. So it was a really important process in terms of making sure they did that properly. But it was the drinking of toloache, which is well known ethnographically, so much so that it's called the toloache or Datura cult sometimes. Mm. There are some accounts of people chewing them after they go through that ceremony, in terms of later on in their life, because typically the taking of toloache is done when you're an adolescent, so it's a coming of age ceremony, and that's really well documented. Most South Central California groups, the Chumash and others, Katanemuk, Gabrielino, Luiseno, many others, they would sequester their children when they're the right age, usually boys, but occasionally girls, and they would prepare them for this ceremony, which would be the making of the toloache. And that could happen within the village itself, or sometimes they would go off somewhere else, and they would the kids would drink this. They'd be looked after by the elders to make sure that they didn't hurt themselves.
Yeah.
And they would, in that process, they would have visions, and those visions might be usually the idea was for them to acquire a spirit helper. And Native Californians, almost invariably, everybody had at least one spirit helper, and that's usually an animal of some sort.
Mm.
So you look for turtle or owl or prairie falcon or any number of different animals to be your own personal spirit guide throughout the rest of your life, an advocate for you in the supernatural to look after you when you need help. But you can get more than one. And so that the Totowachi ceremony was that point in your life when you get your first power animal. And that might be fine. That might be, okay, you do that, you've got your first power animal, you're good to go, you never need another one, and you never dabble with Datura again the rest of your life. But you might dabble with it more, or you might take it as a medicine. Most accounts that we have for the taking of Datura later on in life is for medicinal purposes.
Yeah.
So if you're ill in some sort. And so there are some accounts of people chewing them in those situations, but never in these like really big group ceremonies.
Mm.
So we didn't think that this stuff we thought it would probably could be something else. Sometimes chews are found that are tobacco, which is a stimulant. So I thought maybe this stuff was tobacco.
Mm.
So what we did is we took some samples.
Like tobacco, didn't it? It does look like tobacco when it was up there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted you. Yeah.
That's okay. Interrupt away. So we sampled some of the chews, and the first thing we tried to do is we tried to get DNA out of them, and we tried a bunch of different labs, and every single one of them came back and said there were inhibitors which blocked the identification of the DNA. Yeah. And so it looks like there's basic gunk in the rock that seeps into the chews, and then that prevents us getting the DNA. And so we started. So I just thought, okay, well, that's all we can do. And then I started this project, the Gordian Knot project, and you came out on this part of that. Yes, and that was mainly focusing on the site of Pleito, which is this, really fabulously painted rock art site. And we're doing all kinds of analytical work. And Matthew Baker from Strathclyde University, he's also part of UCLan scene. I was telling him about Pinwheel Cave. And he said, oh, well, part of what I do is I try to identify the molecular compounds in plants. Maybe we can try and find the atropine and scopolamine in Datura, in those, and see if it's atropine and scopolamine in the samples that you took, then it would be Datura. I thought, well, there's no way you're going to do that because we couldn't even get DNA out of it. So, it's foolish of you to try it, but if you want to try, go ahead. So we gave him some of the first samples that we took. And sure enough, they found atropine and scopolamine in the samples. So that was a moment where it was like, oh my, they really are Datura, which was, I wasn't really expecting that. And when they were able to identify the atropine and scopolamine, I thought, that's great. But there was a problem with that. And the problem is that there's the minuscule chance that other plants could contain atropine and scopolamine at trace levels, and they were identifying those really trace levels.
Right, got you.
So, such as modern tomato. Yeah. So Datura is related. So you could have some naysayer come along and say, well, it could be Datura, it could be tomatoes they shoved up in there. So why they would be anyway. So we took some more samples. We sent the lot off to Carolyn Cartwright at the British Museum to do SEM work, so with a scanning electron microscope, and we sent her all kinds of samples from the Wind Wolves Preserve of tobacco. We sent tule brush, any type of plant that we could think that could have been chewed and stuck up in there. We sent, including Datura from right near the cave. And she was able to identify that every single one of those samples that we provided from her were Datura except one, and one of them was yucca, which is a food source for the Native Californians and the Chumash, and there are accounts of them chewing it. So, but sometimes the yucca can be used as medicine as well. So we had one yucca, but all the rest, 14 of them, were Datura samples. I think it was 14. So Yeah, so we were able to definitively show that they were actually consuming Datura there.
Well, that was a moment. And of course, or do you think? I'm saying, of course. Do you think that this is going to have wider implications across the other rock art sites, either in that area or even wider? Like an assumption, really, that does it follow that, you know, that they made this artwork? I've seen a lot of it, and some of it is really. It's beautiful, but it's very difficult to get your mind around what's actually going on. It was for me anyway, not being specialist. Yeah. But do we think that they were in altered states of consciousness because of this drug in wider and earlier in the later prehistory period?
Well, we dated those chews, and so there is a big debate. Well, a big debate amongst like 3 people, but a big debate nevertheless about whether when or Datura started being consumed, because the accounts we have come from the early Spanish missionaries and stuff like that, and there's this suggestion that the taking of Datura was a reaction to colonialism, and it was they started really doing this because of the impact upon colonialism on their society, and that then Datura wasn't really taken in California before that. But we dated one of the chews, and it could potentially be back to 1530-ish AD. The central date is probably around 1600 AD, and that's before the founding of any missions. Yeah. So we have evidence for this is prehistoric usage, but that's as old as it gets so far, and there's no real good evidence that's come from any archaeological places in California to really know for sure if it's earlier. But there is something interesting because in Chumash mythology, there's a really central figure called Old Woman Momoy. She's a grandmother, and she is the personification of the Datura plant. And this mythological tradition clearly has deep antiquity to it. They're very complex. They have lots of different characters, and all kinds of really crazy supernatural things occur. And Old Woman Momoy is a central figure in a lot of them. And it's really highly unlikely that such a core central figure of such cultural importance in Chumash languages and mythology would have been such a late adaptation. Yeah. So in all likelihood, this has a much older, much older. But because it's an organic material, it doesn't survive in deposits. And if you find you might find Datura seeds occasionally are found in archaeological deposits, but these plants grow just naturally in the environment. So there's no way to know really. Even if they're burnt, they could just be residual burnt seeds from a fire. So it's almost impossible to ever identify that. So that is only because they stuck these chews up in the crevices were we able to say that be able to date them because they survived. So whether or not they're part of the wider tradition of other rock art sites is not provable from this situation, but it's suggested by this. And so that the pinwheel element. So a lot of it hinges on how do you look at that painting. Is it in fact a representation of the Datura plant, which I think it is. If it isn't, it's fooling us really well. Yeah. Because we saw it as Datura in the very first instance, and that's why we thought that that the plant might be Datura, and we identified the plant as Datura. I should say also that Tom Ash and Patrick Quinney did the analysis of the chews to show that they had in fact been masticated, and we looked at them in a high magnification, and that material has been heavily pulverized. Yeah. So this is highly processed stuff that's been chewed. So the evidence suggests that. So this whole taking of Datura right where this plant is highly suggestive that this is in fact a painting of Datura. So what you want to do then is go, do you find this image at other rock art sites? And if so, there you go. Well, there's like 2 or 3 other pinwheels that have the 5 lines coming off of them, but there's lots of other pinwheels that only have 3 lines coming off of them. So it looks like there's this process of codification going on where this plant is being represented in the rock art, at least in Pinwheel Cave, and they're showing it right at that moment just before it flowers. It's a really specific moment right before it flowers, and maybe that's like a metaphor for the trance experience of just before you're going into the trance experience, you know. And if so, perhaps that's being utilized in other rock paintings, but they're not the same. No other painting is exactly like this that has those 5 beautifully made pinwheeling elements coming off of it. So maybe they've reduced it into like a, you know, into an icon of the 3-wheeled pinwheels might mean that, but you know, it's really difficult to know. So and this site, you know, maybe other sites were used for the taking of Datura. It's very possible. Why should this site be the exception? But we don't really know because we don't have the evidence. And you know, rock art could be made for a whole variety of different reasons. You know, why do we use paint today? Yeah. You know, how many different uses of paint do we use today? So why should every painting that's being made in a native culture always be the origination of the same exact motivation? So it's really hard to extrapolate this to other sites without, you know, finding better evidence to support that.
And will the methodologies that you used or developed really using the other experts, etc., will that, well, do you think that will assist in maybe identifying Datura in other sites as well, maybe, or
if there's other organic remains that we can look at? Yeah. If there's any organic remains, any fibrous stuff that knocking about that comes about either through excavation or has been gathered in the past, there are like other quids that have been found at Chumash sites in the Chumash backcountry that are at like different museums that have never been analyzed. So we can potentially get some more information by doing further research in this area. Yeah.
And you work with or collaborate with the Chumash people of today. They're clearly involved in this in some respects. What do they think of the results?
Well, they you really should ask them. But well, first of all, I work with the Taphone Indian tribe. Yeah. And so the Taphone Indian tribe are a tribe that's made up of many different original ethnic groups. So they're not just Chumash. They have like Yokuts and Katanamuk and other native descent populations are a part of that tribe. And so in amongst them are some Chumash people. So the Pinwheel Cave is found on this borderlands area. It was right in this area where the whole mixture of different linguistic groups all living, you know, within sight of each other. So it was a really dynamic cultural area in terms of the mixing of different people in really cool ways. And so so I work with the Taphone tribe. So this site falls within their official sort of landscape, their review, their remit. And so I work with them. And so there are other Chumash tribes that are further afield, and I do communicate with them as well. But I work directly with the Taphone tribe. And they I think what they've gotten most out of this is being reintroduced to this site in a way that wasn't possible before. So because they now know about the rock art there and they know about this the taking of Datura, they now come back to this site to reconnect to this place that was obviously really important to their ancestors. And so and it's, you know, they're, you know, the modern native Californians, you know, they all have jobs and they drive pickups or they have mobile phones, cell phones, and they're you know, they're just ordinary people hanging out doing their thing, but they're also native people. And so they you know, they've been dispossessed of their traditional lands, so they you know, have mortgages and they rent apartments in places like Bakersfield and other places. And so they're really disconnected from their traditional day-to-day life ways, even though they know about all that through their own oral history, and they have their own traditions, and they have their own practices, and they have their own knowledge base. They're still getting to their landscapes, of their traditional landscapes, is difficult. But the Windwills Preserve has opened up that access, has created that access, or maybe you could say they've got out of the way of that access.
Yeah.
And so that enables them now to come back and come to these sites. And so now Pinwheel Cave, they come back to the site every year for their own ceremonies. So they've been able to sort of recreate their. They don't take Datura because they recognize its toxicity, and that's not something that they're doing as a tribal practice anymore. But they understand the importance that it had within their culture already, but now they know specifically where it was happening. At least in one instance. So they're able now to come back to the place and re-engage with the site. So they bring their kids out, and their kids are out there, and they're really more interested in the oak trees and the animals and the land and the rocks. And what I find really cool about the Native peoples is that they kind of look at everything as being important. As, we get really overly fussed about the archaeology, and believe me, archaeology is important to them, but the rock itself and the being out there and having a conversation, being in the moment and respectful, those things are really important to them. So it's great just experiencing places with them, because it makes me look with new eyes myself at everything that's happening.
And really, just all of it, the archaeological science aspect of this aside, the fact that your work and your team's work have been able to give that back to that community, and allow them to almost reconnect with that again. It's I think it's a brilliant thing. So is there anything else that you wanted to add, Dave?
Well, just one thing is that I really appreciate what the Native Americans have done to let a lot of this happen, but also like you and all the students who've come out over the years to the Windwills Preserve, everything that they contribute to this process, makes it all happen. Yeah. So it's great for the university and for the students themselves to be able to contribute to this kind of research. So all those years of slogging away, digging holes, sieving stuff, finding every little bit of evidence, all this sort of stuff, that it takes a while to get that stuff out into publication and to make that knowledge available. But it's just really great that the students are able to really help all this to happen. So
yeah. I mean, I like all that just from my own small part of it. The fact that it was only 4 or 5 years ago I was at university full time with you, and to be offered to go to a place like California, I was actually had to pinch myself. It was just a stunning place and a great project to be involved in. So excellent. Well, I mean, well done. It's just an amazing paper to you and your team.
Cool. Thank you.
And anybody who wants to read it, I'll put it in the comments. The link to it. It's all over the UCLan Archaeology and Anthropology site on Facebook anyway, so you can get those links. So thanks very much, Dave. Really appreciate your time. I know you're busy. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you.